When I look at the conflict in the southern Cameroons, a key reason to its failure is because the mediating parties do not have leverage. There has to be a leverage. There has to be a sort of bargain that you must commit to this. And if you don't commit to this, these are the repercussions. But because there are no repercussions, I think that a conflicting party can get away with murder and renege from a peace process.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is episode 2 of our 2-part interview with Dr. Lilian Atanga and Henry Atem Oben, key players in efforts to drive forward peace between Ambazonia and Cameroon. In our first episode, we explored the origins of the southern Cameroon's conflict, tracing how decades of cultural and institutional erosion fueled resentment in Anglophone Cameroon. Lilian and Henry discussed a series of missed opportunities for negotiations and gave frank insights into the historical and social complexities that led to the conflict's escalation and how local efforts have continuously struggled against the centralized government's approach. Now, in the second episode, we will dive into the recent Canadian-led peace talks, breaking down what went right and where things fell short. Our guests reflect on the challenges of creating a unified Ambazonian delegation, the need for women's inclusion, and how trust, or the lack thereof, shaped the process. We will also look at the critical question, what will it take for future peace efforts to succeed where others have failed? Let's dive into the conversation. Let's talk a little bit about the actual Canadian process. There was the series of meetings. In terms of thinking about lessons learned for a future peace process, you mentioned one of the lessons is it should be a multi-stakeholder from the mediation side, not just one country. What worked, what didn't work in the Canadian process? Did the parties ever meet face-to-face? Were they in the same hotel? Was it shuttle between? Did the government even show up in any meaningful way?
I think there were 3 meetings. All were face-to-face with representatives from, I think, 5 Ambazonian groups, plus representatives from the Ambazonian leaders jailed in Cameroon. Each Ambazonian group had 2 representatives. The government, I think, had, in some cases, 5 or 6 people representing the government, appointed by the Prime Minister, but to represent the government. And I think those who represented the Ambazonian, who were part of the Ambazonian delegation, had executive positions in all the groups that participated, while the government, as we are told, were mainly the civil servants within the government. We were also made to understand that most of the government officials were reporting directly to the Prime Minister. And there was a possibility of having more advanced or ministerial level team if the talks had, moved to more substantive discussions. But I think what was very interesting was the behavior of the Ambazonian delegation itself. While the Cameroon delegation had one principal, who was the Prime Minister, the Ambazonian delegation had 5 or more principals who were the various leaders of all the different groups. And luckily, we had figured that if we brought the principals together, it will be easy to manage the entire delegation. And that's what we did. so that they could be able to agree on certain aspects and then transmit the information to their representative, who eventually part of the Ambazonia delegation. But I think one of the challenge that the delegation faced was that they agreed to nominate a leader of a delegation, who some of them contested, said he was an executive of one of the groups. And I believe we had a situation of Syria where a neutral person was appointed to be the leader of the delegation of the opposition groups. In the Ambazonian case, that was not decided as such. We proposed, but as you know, the principals have the final say. They decided one renowned lawyer who has a broad history of the Ambazonian struggle to be the leader. But of course, as the discussions went on, first meeting, second meeting, they started to realize that the leader has some powers. And some of the principals thought that the leader's power will be tilted towards favoring the group that he was coming from. And so there was a kind of a backdoor discussions on trying to undermine the leader's effort, but we tried as much as possible to guide them, and again, with your assistance, to guide them for them to stay on track. And thank God that they stood their grounds to make sure that whatever was discussed with the government of Cameroon, there was a unifying voice from the Ambazonian delegation. And most of those resentment, those misunderstandings about leadership, who is the leader and what powers does the leader has, did not impact the delegation's participation during the talks. But that was a critical moment, a real lesson learned that we take up, and subsequently we hope that the Ambazonian delegation would learn from that as well when they engage in any future negotiations or dialogue.
Now, I remember, Henry, you and I had quite a few conversations around that time that this was nothing out of the ordinary. Any self-determination movement, any non-state party always has a plethora of voices and trying to figure out how to sit across the table from a government which has one voice.
Yeah.
Let me pick up on that plethora of voices and turn to you, Lilian, and what efforts were undertaken to include women in the delegation, in the process, and to empower them to effectively engage on the Ambazonian delegation?
Well, in these initial pre-talks, my understanding was that there were physically in play no women, although later on a woman was brought in to represent women. However, I would say there was no intentional absence of women, in that at that material moment, it was still trying to build the frameworks of that negotiation. But prior to that, women have been largely included in all training, in all meetings by the Ambazonian groups, and the CDM played a critical role in that. First, by identifying different women's groups. Secondly, by bringing them into all the spaces where there's been meetings with Ambazonian groups, like the 2 Canada conferences prior to that. And in all of that, women had the space to articulate their presence, their need, and the need for women to be present in peace talks. With all of this training that the CDN gave and all the spaces in which women were, one can safely say that at that material moment, although there were no women on the table, there was the consciousness of the need for women in the event of an expansion of these talks. It's something that prior to 2020, 2021, we wouldn't be sure of intentionally including women in these groups because it was all about the aim of C rather than a group that represent a cross-section of the population, with women being a critical population of that community. I should say that I am pretty sure that had the talks continued, there would be a representation, a large representation of women, because that had happened in previous conferences. And this was only a beginning of the talks where frameworks were being laid, and there was the consideration of the inclusion of women. And I must say that an organization like, two organizations actually, like the Takumbang, which was a diaspora movement, which is very present in the conflict, and the Southwest Northwest Women's Task Force and other ground movements were very present on the grassroots and have been in all the spaces, even including the major national dialogue. Although they didn't play a critical role, I think it wouldn't be possible to keep women away from the talks because women have been trained enough, both by the CDN and even Swiss Peace, prepared for dialogue and negotiation.
But I think the delegation understood the necessity to have a broad acceptance of the talks, even though some groups had declined to participate. Now, the selection of which group to attend was not done by the Ambazonian group themselves, it was done by Canada. I think that was a conscious decision by Canada with the hope that in subsequent meetings down the road, women groups would also be involved. But as the talks went on, the groups invited that were taking part were requested to include women, right, in their delegation, and which they did. But also, what the Ambazonian delegation also did was their openness to have groups that were not invited to be part of the discussions before any meeting with the Cameroon delegation. So we had, in those meetings of the principals, you had leaders of groups that were not invited, were not taking part in the discussions, present and contributing, and even having debriefing sessions and ensuring that their voices were also part of the discussion. And so that was something that we applauded the Ambazonian groups that were participating, their willingness to bring more. But there was also a consensus that should they arrive at a reasonable agreement, how would they implement? So it was not just about ensuring that women were represented, but it was also about making sure that all the other independent armed groups on the ground who were not invited, how would their voices be heard? How would they make sure that whatever decision that they take or any agreement, those who are not participating are also part of the implementation process? So in that, there was a general agreement that after the pre-talks had ended, when it went to substantive discussions, a broader Ambazonian delegation would be constituted to involve women, to involve representatives of independent armed groups, but other political groups who were not also part of the discussion. One notable point is also that even groups that had declined to participate were ready to engage when it came to substantive discussions. So there was a general acceptance that everybody needed to be part of the discussion, to the extent that the leaders who were jailed in prison also had a representative attending them and briefing them in jail what was happening in Canada. So all of those discussions took place to ensure that, everybody, not just a few segment of the Ambazonian group representatives were taking part. They're also ensuring that everyone, a broader segment of the Southern Cameroonian community, were able to contribute to whatever discussion they were having in Canada.
Henry, I'm glad you explained that. And then I want to get some of your thoughts, Lilian, because there's never enough space at the table in the negotiating room for the non-state actors. There's so many constituencies, and all of the groups we work with around the globe are always trying to figure out how do we have those constituencies' views represented or incorporated at the table. So I'm glad you walked us through that very elaborate process for getting the voices of the Ambazonians at the table. Lilian, thoughts on that, and thoughts on how the Ambazonians created equality, parity at the table with the government to be able to effectively negotiate, and did the Canadians help facilitate that in any way?
Earlier, I used the word trust. When the Ambazonian groups had their invitations, there are a few of those groups that turned their own invitation down. And I believe one of the reasons was trust. As Henry just noted, as the process was going on, these groups that turned the invitation down, when there was to be the announcement, the communiques were to be released by the government of Canada, the government of Cameroon, and the Ambazonian groups, those groups that turned down their invitations started indicating that they are ready to engage in that process. This, I believe, was because they started seeing trust. They started believing that the government of Cameroon can keep their word, and that with a third-party mediation like Canada, the process can be trusted. All the different groups that were not in Canada were now elevating themselves and aligning to the process and having a buy in the process. And that in itself was strengthening the process. The strengthening of that process through a buy-in by even very recalcitrant groups, bringing the whole Ambazonian community as one engaged in the process, I believe became a very strong force for the Republic of Cameroon to reckon with, which I believe they did not anticipate, because this then balanced the power from a state party which had all the resources from financial to human to intellectual resources, and a party which they thought were rigrags, who were terrorists, who were thugs, who were uneducated, who were inexperienced, and who were fragmented and separated and disunited. But then this is my analysis, seeing that this other team that they thought was not a team that was balanced had brought themselves up to a level that they can have real man-to-man. I don't like using that expression man-to-man, but man-to-man dialogue of equality of status in terms of resources, especially intellectual resources, and unity of purpose, then became a problem. Because what I think is the government of Cameroon always wants to be in a position where they are a step ahead of the Ambazonian groups, to be in a position where they can easily say, these guys are terrorists. The majority of English-speaking Cameroonians do not want independence. They want to remain in Cameroon. These are just the diaspora team trying to cause trouble in Cameroon, and so on and so forth. But then the alignment of the different Ambazonian groups, including even those that the government thought were not going to align, then became a threat to the government of Cameroon, became a threat to the implementation of their resolutions of the major national dialogue, which then meant that they were going to go out of the books as to their planned actions. And I believe that is why the government reneged on the talks. The question we are asking now is what can be done, or what is the government foreseeing as a solution to this problem? Or does the government think that they have solved the problem by silence, by not engaging? Because silence has been a key strategy of the government of Cameroon in major national conflicts. When I say conflicts, I don't mean armed conflicts. Is silence again going to be one of his strategies? Or do they think they have won militarily? That's a question that is flying in the air.
I want to ask two substantive questions, and then I want to get into the collapse of the process, which had a very bizarre twist. And then also next steps forward, and in particular with Paul Bia's age and recent absence from the public scene in Cameroon. Let's dive in, if I may, with two of the substantive issues. One is that the Canadians put a ceasefire on the table, apparently, during the last round of negotiations. I'd be curious for your thoughts on the quality of this ceasefire, the depth of the thinking going into it, and whether that was a wise first step. Sometimes the peace process achieves momentum because of a ceasefire, and other times you get diverted from the process into the details of a ceasefire. What are your thoughts on the Canadian proposed ceasefire during those talks, and what lessons could be learned from that conversation?
The Canadian government did not put any draft ceasefire on the table. We had meetings with the principals of every participating group except for one. We were briefed, and of course, blessed to have you provide the guidance to the delegation. So both delegations were to submit a draft of CBMs for discussion during the fourth meeting. And the government delegation submitted a list of CBMs, and a temporary cessation of military operation was a major part of their submission. A major piece in the Ambazonian submission was the release of all prisoners, or at least progressive release of prisoners. So these were just submissions, and no discussions were held to elaborate on these submissions. The meeting that was supposed to be held to elaborate on these submissions, I mean, the CBNs were many. So that meeting did not take place. In between the announcements from Canada, the commitment from Ambazonia, and while awaiting the commitment from the Cameroon government, there were discussions on how to form technical committees to elaborate on some of these CBMs that were being submitted by both delegations. And so the resolution was that the fourth meeting we will concentrate the fourth meeting on discussing the CBMs, among which was the case of a temporary cessation of hostility. The Ambazonian delegation was already trying to work around the constitution of a technical team to start discussing the terms of a potential cessation of hostility, the terms of the release of prisoners, and what the CBM agreement between both parties would look like. But that discussion never happened in the fourth meeting because the government, of course, denied sending people to Canada and denied even asking the government of Canada to engage in mediation. But cessation of hostility was part of the discussions that the government submitted, I think a month or 3 weeks, cessation of hostility that the government with the possibility of an extension. That was a submission done by the government, among other issues like cessation of hate speech, kidnappings, while the Ambazonian delegation was mainly ensuring that the military returned to their barracks and that there were no controls, the release of prisoners. But all of that were supposed to be subject of a meeting between the two delegations, but never occurred. So Canada was left in the fix and could not move further in going into the CBMs.
The government of Cameroon turned down the Swiss and said they never had an engagement with the Swiss on any peace process. They did the same with Canada. They will probably do the same with another country, and all of that with impunity. Technically, I wonder, this sounds like a diplomatic thing where the government of Canada puts up a statement and the government of Cameroon rejects the statement. Diplomatically, how does that play? And if systematically one government keeps denying engagements with other governments on a peace process like this, what is it then that can hold that government to a peace process? We understand that there is a discussion of the sovereignty of a nation, and the government of Cameroon keeps insisting that it's an internal problem and that the major national dialogue has taken care of that problem, that there are resolutions from the major national dialogue which are in the process of being implemented, including the presidential plan for reconstruction and development, which they insist is going on, and all of that. This was a major failure, at least in the eyes of Cameroonian, for Canada. What is there to show that another country would succeed where Switzerland and Canada have failed? Harry did mention that a multi-state peace process may be the solution. What is it that can hold the government down in such engagements? Maybe Harry knows the answer, but is there any written engagement between Cameroon and Canada on this? I'm trying to look at how the government of Canada feels or has taken to this failed process. Is it a pause to the process, or is it a failure in the process? I'm asking questions that I don't have answers to, which probably I shouldn't be asking, but which I think are very important, because we look at resources, human, financial, material, time resources that are put into a process that fail. What can we do differently for it to work? I don't know. I don't have answers.
And the backdrop for our listeners is, after that round of negotiations, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada made a public statement that they would be, facilitating these technical committee groups, that they were going to be involved in the process. And then the president's office in Cameroon essentially said, "What are you talking about? Well, we never asked Canada to do this. We don't have a process." So, Lilian, your questions are good, because that doesn't usually happen. People at least admit to a process, and then they walk out of a process. They don't simply deny the reality of that process. But Henry, tell us the story and answer Lilian's questions.
Yeah, let me say that it was not the first time the government was dropping out of the peace initiative, right? After years, 2 to 3 years of allowing the Swiss to work on the possibility of having peace talks, the government pulled out. So the denial followed an established pattern, fortunately, but also brought to the spotlight the internal divide, within the government. And I must say, there are people within the government who genuinely want the government to dialogue with the Ambazonian groups. Others see a military solution from a political and financial advantage lens. The government of Cameroon and the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, I would say the Canadian government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs will not engage in such a journey without a legitimate Cameroon government request asking Canada to help. So, of course, everybody knew that the statement by the government was, of course, just a way to escape from something, from the process. Prior to the announcement of the major national dialogue, the pressure was both from internal and external. And it would have been very difficult for the government to pull out. And of course, that is why they even called it national dialogue, because of the pressure. 2022, the conflict dynamics alone made it very easy for the government to pull out, because there were more or less sporadic fighting, not as intense as it was in 2018. The international community was not putting a lot of pressure on the government to even engage in dialogue. There were just few statements here and there. And so the government, that internal pressure was not there, as well as the external pressure. And because the government had also said, well, we are advancing with reconstruction. We have created DDR. We have created a bilingualism commission. So that alone lessened the amount of international pressure that they were receiving. And from the Ambazonian end, that was not seen as a factor that may increase government's momentum to engage in a process. So those in the government who were pro-dialogue, of course, initiated the Canadian talks without a consensus with those that were pro-military solution. And so when the process was evidently being seen as a real negotiation process, away from the national dialogue context, those community solutions had an upper hand, that even if there was supposed to be a dialogue, it should have been in alignment with the resolutions of the national dialogue. But the way we are seeing this one going, it seems it is a full-fledged negotiations away from the national dialogue. And so they had no open hand to convince President Biya that we should pull out of it. Now, in part, also because it was a unilateral facilitator, it was Canada alone. If it had other people, other countries like that of Tigray in Ethiopia, we would have had more pressure on the government not to leave, even though we had comments from the US, we had comments from statements from the US, statements from the UK, statements from the Vatican, congratulating the parties for their commitment to discuss. Of course, those statements came after the Canada statement. But as soon as Cameroon, denied, we never heard of any follow-up from those countries that made those statements. So, there were no sanctions, there were no pressure on the government, and things stayed the way they are till date. So if we had a multi-state facilitation process, including the UK, or Canada, the US, or the UN, it is believed that, the pressure, Cameroon would have felt the pressure. And even those who are for military solution would have been able to, would have accepted for the process to move forward. That's my take. And I think that also represents the take of the CDA.
Well, there may be some change on the horizon in Cameroon. Their elections are coming up. President Biya is 91 years old. He's the second longest serving president in Africa. He's been out of the public spotlight for the last few months. 2, 3, 4 years from now, what are you thinking the dynamic might be, the context for, the first question we started with context. This is our penultimate question. What will the context be in a couple of years, or what are some of the options for what the context might be, and how might that impact the possibility for a renewed process and efforts to build a durable peace?
That would definitely depend on who takes over after Biya, because at the moment, there is no prospect of under Biya for any dialogue or negotiations to take place, given what has happened already. But post Biya, of course, except the regime changes drastically, but you will still have people who are in support of a military solution, people who are in support of dialogue. And regardless of who takes over, if there's no consensus within government on a particular approach to dialogue, away from the national dialogue, the government will still remain the way it is at the moment. My guess is that what happened in 2016 was the beginning of the reawakening of Southern Cameroonians. Whatever thing sparks again, like they did in 2016, the conflict will start afresh, and it will be worse than what they have witnessed in the past years. If that happens, that will trigger a lot, and those who are pushing for a military solution will not have that leeway to say we succeeded with a military solution, and will definitely move towards those who are advocating for dialogue and negotiations. If that happens, then there's a possibility that, the government will be open to engage in genuine negotiations and dialogue with the Ambazonian people.
Lilian, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes. To answer that question, it would be good to look at the internal political dynamics in Cameroon. Having been in government and having put in place a system which is largely based on nepotism and tribalism from the grassroots, which means from the educational system right up to the political system, where people who are trained in government institutions are largely from an elite group related to the ruling class. It therefore means that a lot of the people who are in key positions in government carry the same political ideology and the same kind of political thinking. Like Henry said, if something drastic doesn't happen, nothing is going to change in terms of government policy. And when we say drastic, we are looking at if the eventual takeover, irrespective of when the year goes, happens with someone who is from, say, the greater south of the Republic of Cameroon, the French-speaking Cameroons, the chances of any big change with regard to how the Southern Cameroonians are treated sociopolitically will not be major, which means that the marginalization would tend to continue because the policies are really not going to change, except someone who can sing, who is not of the system, who thinks differently from the current political thinking and want a total overhaul of the system. We don't see anything changing. However, to think that this is going to die is a false thinking, because the people are currently aware of what they ought to have, which they are not having. They are aware of the repression. They are aware of the suffering they've gone through. They are aware of the people they've lost due to violence, which is violence. It's different when you lose someone due to violence from a known state group, but when you lose someone due to violence from the state, it means that you're going to continue rebelling against the state. And a lot of people have lost people and property due to state violence. Without any drastic change, we don't see this being resolved, for one. And we also don't see this ending. So it's going to be a latent conflict which can stack up at any moment. It may seem quiet now, but that is not the end. Although I also do not see a resolution to the conflict in the next couple of years. I really don't see it, given that I don't see any engaged state party which has an interest in resolving this particular interest. So whether Biya stays until after 2025 or someone takes after Biya 2025, if that person is from the Greater South, and when I say Greater South, I'm excluding the northern regions and the northwest and southwest region, anyone from the other regions, I really do not see a drastic change in policy. Because the general thinking of Francophones is the Anglophones have to stay with Cameroon. It is not about justice for Anglophones, which is a different thing. It's about they have to stay, irrespective of whether they have justice or not.
Let me go ahead and end with one last question for both of you. And this is, a number of our listeners are young professionals, mid-career professionals who will find themselves in peace negotiations, either on mediation teams, representing parties, non-state armed actors, non-state civil society, or governments. Given your experience over the years, what is your one key takeaway that you want our young professional listeners, our mid-career professional listeners, to remember and to know about how to build better peace agreements, how to be effective in complex peace negotiations?
Well, for me, I've had very short experience in peace negotiations. I've had very short experience living in conflict situations. Nothing is certain. You can't be certain about anything. And it's a process that it is very versatile. It is very unpredictable. However, any process that is not inclusive of the people, any process that does not dig down to the root causes and engage in the root causes and build it upward will not work. However, one other thing is, in any conflict, even if the whole people suffer from a common problem, there are diverse approaches to solving that. So there is then necessarily a plethora of proposals to the solution. From this, my personal experience is that although people will belong to different groups with different orientations, as a people, there's always one problem that is common that all the people suffer from. And one person cannot speak for all the people. It's important to engage the different stakeholders. It's important to bring these people together and listen to everyone, because one group can wreck the whole peace process. No one group can bring peace to a people. So it is important to engage all the different stakeholders. However, when it comes to negotiating peace between the conflicting parties, I think it's important not just to have the mediating party bring these two groups together, but for that mediating party to have an important leverage on the two conflicting parties. Because when I look at the conflict in the southern Cameroons, a key reason to its failure is because the mediating parties do not have leverage, or have not shown that they have leverage on the conflicting parties. The government of the Swiss and the Canadians have not been able to do anything to the government of Cameroon or to the people of Ambazonia to bring them to solving this conflict. There has to be something, there has to be a leverage, a commitment that these governments can hold these two conflicting parties to in that negotiation. I still think that there has to be a bargain, a sort of bargain that, okay, for us to engage in this, you have to commit to this, and you must commit to this. And if you don't commit to this, these are the repercussions. But because there are no repercussions, I think that a conflicting party can get away with murder and renege from a peace process. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilian. Henry, key takeaway.
Key takeaways is that usually in a peace process, you have difficulty dealing with a multi-stakeholder delegation. But in this case, you also had a government that was also divided. So it's important to understand the context under which any negotiation is supposed to take place. Make sure that you have enough time, because one of the challenges that we had was a challenge of time. Resources are also very important. As a peace expert or negotiations expert, you need to also know the dynamics, the internal dynamics, especially in the multi-stakeholder non-state actor delegation. We're lucky to have had the opportunity to work with the different, at least the majority of the participating groups years before the talks. And that confidence, that trust that we had built with them helped us to bring them together. So if you don't have that trust, you need to build it way in advance, but also listen, not just meetings, face-to-face or virtual meetings, but also try to have individual meetings with the various groups, not only wait when they are all together, because you have a sense of what they want to see. So in the background, you are able to merge all their expectations and able to prepare in advance how you run the meetings with those different views. It is very important also to make sure that you highlight inclusivity at the onset of your engagement with these actors, whether the state or non-state actors. Because without inclusivity, they tend to forget that they are representing a cross-section of groups and individuals. On the government side, I would say dealing with the government is very tricky, because especially if you are trusted by the non-state actor, if they see you with the government, they'll be a little bit reticent. They'll withdraw themselves in providing you more information. So we were very careful in making sure that we dealt with the Ambazonian delegation only and providing them with the necessary assistance that they needed. And be open also to seek assistance if you know that there are areas that you are not well vested. Because don't only say that because you are a mediation or peace expert, you know everything. Now, we were open to seeking advice and guidance from those we believe had more experience in the field. And thankfully, we had Dr. Williams with us to provide us with the necessary input and guidance that the Ambazonian delegation needed. That's one. For the international delegation, it's very important to know the behavior of the state party. That should inform how you see the international, the mediator or mediators. The behavior is not necessarily that if you have a single mediator, the peace process would not go. Because if that was the case, Bougainville would have had their independence. East Timor would have had their independence because they had just a single mediator. But also the behavior of the state party is very important, because if you look at the case of South Sudan, the behavior of the state party informed that there should be a multi-nation facilitation team like AGAD and more guarantors to ensure that Sudan was able to implement the outcome of a negotiation. So that understand the context and the dynamics of the state party is very important also to inform how we shape the mediation process and the parties that should be involved as part of the mediation team. Overall, a lot of work is needed. A lot of comparative analysis is needed as a peace actor to be able to drive through that process. But most importantly, trust with the actors that you deal with immediately is very important.
Lilian, Henry, it's been a real honor and privilege to have this conversation with you. This is unparalleled experience and expertise on the conflict in Cameroon and the efforts to build a durable peace. I'm so excited that you've been so generous with your time for myself and for our listeners to learn about the failed efforts so far, but what might be possible in the future. So thank you very much for taking the time and having this conversation with me and with our listeners.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for us to reflect on a process which we might have gone through without thinking. This was a good time to think back on what we did. Thank you very much.